Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Lincoln Area Archives Museum, Silver Star Parlor of the Native Sons of the Golden West, and Jerry Logan's book about Sheridan for information presented in this video. I would also like to recognize Wes Freeman, who provided content for Jerry's book. Let's go back before Europeans and describe the area around Sheridan. The Sacramento Valley was a large floodplain without levees, filled with wetlands, oaks, tule elk, and waterfowl. It was difficult to traverse by wagons. The Bear River got its name for there being so many bears. We're not just talking brown bears, but also grizzlies. Salmon migrated up the streams. The local Indians, the Nisenan, used fire to clear underbrush along the Bear River. Spanish explorers described it as being like a park. A man could ride a horse at a full gallop. Native Americans arrived in the area tens of thousands of years ago. At least 9 settlements have been identified along the Bear River and the surrounding area. They were the Nisenan, a subgroup of the Maidu. They ranged from the valley to the mountains along the American, Bear, and Yuba rivers. There was a large population with a well-established and advanced culture. The population was one of the last to clash with Europeans. Early Mexicans and Spanish had contact with them, but mostly they left each other alone. In 1833, a malaria epidemic decimated the tribes. The discovery of gold was the final blow. It destroyed their livelihood. Silt from gold mining killed the fish and flooded their hunting grounds. A vigilante army calling themselves the Placer Blades annihilated almost all of the Nisenan along the American and Bear rivers. Violence between the Nisenan and immigrants was so extreme, the army established Camp Far West along the Bear River near present-day Wheatland to mediate. A few Nisenan worked as servants and on ranches. By 1850, there were still accounts of a few Indians around the Sheridan area, but by 1860, most were gone or absorbed into the white man's economy. One of the first settlements that should be mentioned is Johnson Ranch. Pablo Gutierrez was given a Mexican land grant in 1844 on the north side of the Bear River, just east of present-day Wheatland. After Gutierrez was killed, John Sutter sold the 22,000-acre ranch to William Johnson and Sebastian Kaiser for $150. It was the first settlements immigrants reached as they entered the Sacramento Valley from the Sierra Nevadas. In late October of 1846, members of the ill-fated Donner Party staggered into Johnson Ranch, seeking help for their snowbound families in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They recovered there before going on to Sutter's Fort to organize a rescue party. (1846) also saw the beginning of the Mexican-American War. By war's end, California and the western United States would change from Mexican to American territory. Captain Hannibal Day and his first lieutenant, George Derby, chose the location for Cantonment Far West, or sometimes referred to as Fort Far West or Camp Far West for several reasons. The cavalry post was established 5 miles northeast of present-day Sheridan in September 28, 1849. The post was located near the Immigrant Trail on the north side of the Bear River, close to Johnson Ranch. It was near the crossroads to Sutter's Fort, Yuba Mines, Feather River Dry Diggings, and the Nicholas Landing on the Feather River. Optimistically, Day and Derby hoped desertion might be kept to a minimum because the soldiers could mine gold nearby in their free time. The fort was tasked with minimizing conflicts between the Indians and the overwhelming number of well-armed miners. A cemetery and monument is dedicated on the site by the native daughters of the Golden West. The fort was ill-equipped for the harsh conditions. They were poorly provisioned. Rain forced them to acquire building supplies to build their own shelter. Scurvy ravaged the company. Desertion was a constant problem as soldiers abandoned their post for the chance to strike it rich in the gold fields. 7 miners deserted the first month. 5 were caught. Day, along with supplies, asked for leg shackles to prevent desertion. Supplies were difficult to transport from the river landing at Nicholas to the camp because of the lack of bridges and stream crossings. The teamsters that hauled freight ran off the horses and then left for the gold fields. Minimizing conflicts between the Indians and the miners was difficult. The miners were well armed, and the Indians only had bows and arrows. In one case, several Indians were killed for taking cattle. A few days later, the strays were found. The Indians struck back, killing Charles Mott, a settler who just happened to be driving his wagon. In retaliation, a militia party killed several bands of Indians and took 10 women and children prisoners and distributed them among the ranches in the valley. Ultimately, he was forced to work with an Indian agent to convince the Indians to give up their land. In correspondence, Day described the fort as being like a penal colony of Botany Bay. The post only lasted 3 years. Many in the Sheridan-Wheatland area do not recognize the historic significance of Claude Chana. Chana, the person represented in the kneeling miner statue in Old Auburn. Chana was born in France in 1811. He arrived at Johnson Ranch in October of 1846, just before the Donner Party would be stranded in the Sierras near Donner Lake. He took a job at Sicard Ranch, northeast of Sheridan on the Bear River. In 1847, he began working at Sutter's Fort as a cooper. There he became friends with James Marshall. After working at Sutter's Fort for about 7 months, he returned to work at Sicard's Ranch. On January 24, 1848, James Marshall discovered gold on a creek near Coloma. When rumors reached the Bear River, Chana decided to visit Marshall in Coloma to see if the rumors were true. There, he quickly learned the technique of gold mining and returned to the ranch to acquire supplies and a group of men to help him mine in Coloma. On the way, they decided to try their luck in Auburn and Ophir. The 3 men mined Auburn Ravine and Baltimore Ravine for 3 weeks. They were disappointed to only finding 3 pounds of gold. They decided to head to the Yuba River to try their luck. Chana used his gold to buy 16,000 acres of farmland on the southern side of the Bear River. He thrived for several years as a winemaker and supplier of nuts, grain, and fruit to the mining camps. But a dispute over ownership of the land trickled away his fortune in legal fees. Flooding in 1862 buried his land in silt and washed out his buildings. The property sold at auction for $500. Chana moved to a smaller section of property and continued to produce thousands of gallons of white wine annually. He died in his Wheatland home in 1882. He is buried in the Wheatland Cemetery. In 1949, the Native Daughters of the Golden West placed a granite marker near his grave. He should be credited for bringing the orchard industry to the area. Eugene Rogers arrived at what would become Sheridan in 1854 or 55. He was born in Norwich, Connecticut. Rogers saw an opportunity at what was the crossroads to Sacramento, Marysville, Grass Valley, Coon Creek, and Nicholas. The town of Lincoln was yet to be settled. Rogers built a home in what was known as the Shed, a 40 by 40 building. Rogers' shed was large enough for freight wagons and stagecoaches to stop. It became a very successful business. 2 stagecoaches and an average of 50 wagons stopped daily. The shed provided food and drink for animals and passengers. Farmers were happy to be able to sell grain and feed and purchase supplies. One of the earliest ranches in the area was owned by Theodore Sicard, a French immigrant. Sicard applied for a Mexican land grant and received 12,000 acres on the South Bear River near Johnson Ranch Crossing in 1842. He started an orchard of peaches and almonds. He would eventually sell property to Claude Chana, who I mentioned in the previous chapter. The discovery of gold in 1848 brought a flood of people to California. In 1849, California sought statehood, and after a heated debate in Congress arising out of the slavery issue, California entered the Union as a free non-slave state by the Compromise of 1850. It became the 31st state, September 9, 1850. The Shed became very popular. 2 evenings a week, dances were held. People from as far away as Auburn, Grass Valley, Marysville, and Sacramento attended. A racetrack was built. It became a prime destination in Placer County. One of the things I found unique was in 1860, a 40-foot tower was built with a telescope on top, so ranchers could keep track of their cattle grazing in the surrounding hills. In 1861, the Civil War began. Rogers was pro-Union. He renamed Rogers Shed to Union Shed, and as a tribute to General Philip Sheridan, named the town Sheridan. The railroad arrived in Lincoln in 1861. Some of Sheridan's population left for opportunities there. Not until the Civil War was winding down in 1866 did money become available and the railroad complete to Sheridan. There was less freight to be hauled by wagons. The shed became less and less necessary. Rogers built his own train depot, fearing the tracks were extended to Wheatland and Marysville, that Sheridan would be bypassed. In the winter of 1861 and 62, California, Oregon, and Nevada suffered the worst flooding in recorded history. A Pineapple Express, a warm rain that fell on a large snowpack, caused rapid melt. Some parts of the Sacramento Valley were covered in 30 feet of water. The floodwaters did not recede until midsummer. Leland Stanford, The newly elected governor rode a boat through the streets of Sacramento to the state capitol for his inauguration. The legislature moved the government to San Francisco for months until the flooding subsided. Claude Chana and Theodore Sicard, whose homes and orchards were on the south side of Bear River, lost almost everything. Sheridan has been ravaged by several fires. In 1868, the Union Shed, the train depot, and a few other businesses were destroyed. The streets had just been laid out in blocks. A new train depot, a post office, were quickly rebuilt further north. The first post office was established July 10, 1868. Young Doherty served as Sheridan's first postmaster. Farmers still needed a place to buy and sell their crops. John Ziegenberg built the first general store in 1869. The town began to prosper as several businesses were established. In 1870, Mr. Blackburn built a substantial flour mill. The town had a bar, the Bedrock Saloon, and Peter Finch owned the blacksmith shop. The Royal Order of Good Templars were established. Never a good thing when a temperate society comes to town. The International Oddfellows organization had a lodge. Eugene Rogers was acting as railroad land agent. Flooding along the Bear River occurred often. In February 1872, reports were spreading of a monster in Yankee Slough. Men carrying pitchforks went to investigate. The monster turned out to be a 7.5-foot, 125-pound sturgeon. In 1874, a new, larger train depot was built and a dance held to celebrate. The next year, a fire destroyed the old depot that Rogers had built and 30 cords of firewood. In spite of setbacks, Sheridan was growing. The mill was now owned by Daniel Click. It was powered by a 60-horsepower steam engine and produced 100 barrels of quality flour a day. Click was financed by Mark Hopkins, who was one of the big four investors that built the Transcontinental Railroad. A 2-story Sheridan Hotel was built and soon renamed the Parrot Hotel. It opened with a ball. There was a Wells Fargo office. O.K. Hopkins, brother of Mark, was a railroad ticket agent and telegraph operator. In 1876, a second hotel was built, the Centennial, for the 100th anniversary of the United States. Mr. Grubbs owned the livery stable. Things were looking up for Sheridan. In 1878, an article appeared in the Placer Herald saying, "Sheridan, we believe, is today the most prosperous town in Placer County." Sheridan and Wheatland have always had a love-hate relationship. It can be summed up with a letter to the editor in the Placer Herald. "We don't want no bridge to Wheatland." The writer inferred that if a bridge were built, Wheatland slickers would be coming to Sheridan. The town voted against contributing even $5 for bridge construction. The bridge was completed December 1877, paid for by Yuba and Sutter counties. There were often disagreements over levees and roadways between Sheridan and Wheatland. Some problems were caused because Wheatland is in Yuba County and Sheridan Placer. Many people worked in Wheatland during harvest season. Some businesses were in both towns. John Zimmerberg, for example, had stores in Lincoln, Sheridan, and Wheatland. Charles Lincoln Wilson hired Charles Holland to lay out the streets for all three towns, Lincoln, Sheridan, and Wheatland. On August 25, 1892, Sheridan was ravaged by its worst fire. A kerosene lamp exploded in the Parrot Hotel at 10 p.m. Mrs. Martin, the hotel manager, screamed a warning to customers there was a fire. Many had to jump from the second floor. The blaze spread rapidly. The Parrot Hotel was in the corner of 13th and G. A strong wind carried embers north across the street, igniting the block. Soon, the whole downtown was ablaze. The Parrot Hotel, the Palisar Hotel, the post office, Bashfield's store, the drugstore, a shoe store, a variety store, Big Store, Curtis Saloon, Young Saloon, and several other businesses were lost. The train station, with its large wooden water tank crowning its peak, burned. Without a fire department, residents struggled to save their homes with buckets of water and burlap sacks. Sheridan never recovered. Afterwards, the business owners and residents left town. Remnants of the old foundations are all that still remain. The population of Sheridan continued declining in the 1890s. The mill closed in 1888. At its peak, the mill had employed 100 men. Dr. Bummel, the town's doctor, moved his practice to Lincoln. In 1892, the Temperance Society were banging the drums for Prohibition. The saloon keeper got tired of living in a town of temperance cranks and sold out. The 1900s began with a much smaller Sheridan. The town folks watched the coming and going of the train. Mail showed up at 4. Eugene Rogers, now 77, retired as postmaster and took up sitting on a box in front of the post office with Bill Woodworth, who was known as Setting Bill. In 1911, Eugene Rogers, founder of Sheridan, died at 88. Rogers had owned several businesses and over 2,000 acres. Because of bad luck, his estate was only worth $748. His wife, Adeline Sandcliffe Rogers, passed away in 1928 at 81 after moving to Merced. Both are buried in the Sheridan Cemetery. In 1854, Charles Lincoln Wilson traveled east to find an engineer to help him build a railroad from Sacramento to Folsom, then north to Lincoln and Marysville. He hired Theodore Judah, an experienced civil engineer who had worked in the Northeast. The Sacramento Valley Railroad would be the first railroad built west of the Mississippi River. Construction began in Sacramento, February of 1855. The first trial run was in August of 1855, and it opened for business in February 22nd of 1856, hauling ore, food, goods, and passengers the 22.9 mile between Folsom and the docks of Sacramento. Wouldn't it be nice to have projects that could be finished as quickly now? Because of conflicts between Wilson and his backers, he incorporated a new company called the California Central Railroad in 1857 to continue building from Folsom to Lincoln. A bridge over the American River was built by 1859. The railroad reached Lincoln in 1861. When fully operational, the California Central Railroad had 18.5 miles of track, 4 locomotives, 4 passenger cars, and 16 freight cars. A round-trip ticket from Sacramento to Lincoln via Folsom was $3 and freight was $4 a ton. Because of the Civil War, money was tight for several years. Not until 1864, when the war was winding down, did construction resume. The rails reached Sheridan in 1866. Eugene Rogers, the founder of Sheridan, had built his own train depot. He was worried that the town would be bypassed for Wheatland if he hadn't built his own. The depot served Sheridan well. A ticket to Lincoln was 75 cents. Flour from Click Mill and milk from Mr. Midley's dairy, grain, fruit, and nuts were loaded and shipped to market. Copper ore from Dairy Hill Mine was shipped to the smelters in San Francisco. Theodore Judah owned Auburn Ravine Station, the property that would become Lincoln. He sold the parcel to Charles Lincoln Wilson on October of 1859. For those that know Lincoln, this was a rectangular parcel from 1st Street to 9th Street, bordered on the east at East Avenue and to O Street on the west. Throughout the 1850s, Judah was known as Crazy Judah for his belief a railroad could be built over the Sierras. Many at the time considered it impossible. Judah performed much of the land survey work to determine the best route over the Sierra Nevada mountains. Sadly, Judah would never see his dream complete. He died of yellow fever on October 2nd, 1863. He contracted the disease while crossing Panama on a voyage to New York. He was trying to secure financing to buy out the Big Four investors. When the Transcontinental Railroad reached Roseville in 1864, the line between Folsom and Roseville was unnecessary and then later removed. Today, light rail uses the right-of-way of the Sacramento Valley Railroad to Folsom. It is very difficult to find a trace of the path from Folsom to Roseville. Sheridan had another railroad that is lesser known. In 1902, gold and silver were discovered at McCourtney Road and Karshner Roads. Soon, a deposit of copper was also discovered. The Dairy Farm Mine was formed. Wagon trains hauled ore the 5.5 miles to the rail station in Sheridan, where it could be shipped to the smelters in San Francisco. In 1914, a narrow-gauge railroad was built from Sheridan to the mine. It ran along Cantonment Far West Road, then east over a low area to McCourtney Road, and then to the mine at Keshner. A large locomotive, Shay No. 1, pulled 8 cars to and fro between the mine and Sheridan. A town formed around the mine named Van Trent. It boasted a post office, store, social hall, theater, and bachelor club. Daily buses ran between Sheridan, Lincoln, and Van Trent. The copper was high in demand during World War I. Suddenly, in 1917, near the end of the war, the mine closed down and the railroad tracks were ripped up. The mine closing had a devastating effect on the Sheridan economy. As the 20th century advanced, access to the railroad became less and less important. Trucks took over the freight and farmers' needs. Cars and the Greyhound bus met transportation needs. Now, even the Greyhound bus is a memory. During the early 70s, 65 was widened and the railroad crossing was improved. The brick warehouse was torn down and side tracks removed. Now, Highway 65 bypass speeds cars past Sheridan turnoff. Trains still speed by, blowing their horns with little notice of Sheridan. In 1919, at least 17 Russian families moved to the Sheridan area. They belonged to the Mulligan Church. Mulligan, loosely translated, is dairy eater, the name given for their belief that it was permissible to eat dairy products during Christian fast. They did not drink, smoke, eat pork, or fish without scales. Because they did not follow exactly the beliefs of the Russian Orthodox Church, they were considered heretics and persecuted. The early 1900s saw major turmoil in Russia. It was the beginning of the Russian Revolution, a period of political and social change across the Russian Empire, with the abolishment of the monarchy and the establishment of the Soviet Union. When the Bolsheviks gained control of the government, the Mulligan Church was forced to move underground. Just before World War I, many of the Russian families moved to the Bay Area, Russian River, Potter Valley, and Mendocino areas. It was the Bay Area group that had the idea of starting a colony in Sheridan. During World War I, they had worked in San Francisco for good wages, in machine shops, riveting building ships, and on the docks and other jobs. The families saved as much money as possible. Max Popoff, the patriarch of the group, decided to start the Mulligan Church and Agriculture Colony near Sheridan. He had learned the wide open space and farmland around the town from his son James, who had left home earlier and lived in the Sheridan area. Sheridan reminded Popoff of the landscape near Kursk, Russia, with its slow rolling hills and terrain. Max Popoff was highly respected by his neighbors as an honest, upright citizen. He wore a flowing white beard and a kartus, a Russian cap with a visor, like the actor wore in the movie Fiddler on the Roof. As matriarch and spiritual leader, he was affectionately known as Torkuska, or grandfather to the other members. In Russia, he was one of the few people who could read and write. He helped poor people and spoke several different languages, including Turkish, Armenian, Slovakian, Russian, and then English. Popoff was the minister of the Sheridan Mulligan Church for several years. When the families first came to the Sheridan area, they were under a cloud of suspicion. Years earlier, a colony of Russian anarchists known as the Aurora Colony had settled in the Mount Pleasant area. I'll talk more about them at the end of this section. Each family purchased large acreage for farming. The group built the Mulligan Church and established the Russian Colony Cemetery in 1922. John Saracroft, when a young man, drove horse and buggy loaded with lumber many miles to where the present church site is. The land for the church was donated by William Boganoff. Establishment of the cemetery was spurred by the death of a young Russian girl. Because she was Russian, she was not allowed to be buried in the American cemetery. So Max Popoff, along with a group of Russian families, built a cemetery. The little girl was the first to be buried there. They must have held hurt feelings for many years. The Russian section was not deeded over to the cemetery district until 1970. There were 17 families listed on the original colony members of Sheridan. Many of the names are still recognized to older Western Plaza residents and include Popoff, Smirnov, Boganoff, Leskatov, Korbanov, Suzov, Sovinskin, and Sarakov. It did not take long for the members to become part of the community. They were hardworking and did not share the anarchist view of the Aurora Colony. Their children attended Sheridan and Valley View School, and many graduated from Lincoln High School. Many of the children would later serve in World War II. Here's a picture of young Willie Boganoff at Valley View School. Willie was a good friend of my family, and would often stop and have coffee with my parents. Here's a picture at the Valley View reunion with him on the right-hand side. This is a picture of his father William and uncle Andrew. Nick Luskatoff and his parents were later immigrants. He and his father, before him, owned the auto repair shop in Sheridan for many years. Nick was born April 10, 1943, in Iran. His parents had escaped communist oppression by walking out of Rostov, Russia, spending 13 years in refugee camps in Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. In 1949, the family qualified to enter America through Ellis Island and traveled by train to Sheridan, joining their sponsored relatives. Nick attended Sheridan Grammar School, followed by Lincoln High School, and continued to receive a BA in mathematics from San Francisco State. Nick was drafted in the Army and served in Vietnam, where he received a Combat Infantry Badge, Army Commendation Medal, and a Bronze Star. He owned the Sheridan Garage for many years. The Russian immigrants worked hard and survived the Depression of the 30s. They were our neighbors and ordinary people raising their families. Some of the Russian descendants I knew were the Sarikoff family in Wheatland. They owned many acres of orchards and farmland, and actually they purchased my family's property in Wheatland. Max Popoff was the janitor at Sheridan School when I attended. George Suzoff had cattle and worked for Caltrans during the mid-70s when they widened Highway 65. Some of the second-generation families have passed away and their children have moved away. The little Russian Mulligan Church still stands in town of Sheridan. In 1959, approximately 21 families in Sheridan and Wheatland area worshiped there. It's still at the intersection of Andresen and Rioso roads and is occasionally used. Not at all affiliated with the Sheridan Russian families was the Aurora Colony, founded by Abraham Isaac. Abraham Isaac was a newspaper editor in Russia and an anarchist. Anarchists do not believe in organized government and aspire to a socialist view. They can vary from a passive to violent overthrow of the government. Isaac got in trouble for his views, and he fled the Tsar's police for Rio de Janeiro in 1889. In 1890, he moved to the United States and lived in San Francisco and then Portland, Oregon. In Portland, Isaac became a member of the Socialist Labor Party and founded the Anarchist Weekly publication. In Portland, authorities closed the Anarchist Weekly on obscenity charges for him publishing Walt Whitman's A Woman Waits for Me. After reading Whitman's work, I'm sure it had more to do with his political views than the work. Abraham Isaac faced more serious problems when he was propelled into the national headline when Leon Krzyzewski shot U.S. President William McKinley in Buffalo, New York on September 6, 1901. Isaac had met the would-be assassin days earlier in Chicago. Anarchists across the country were arrested and jailed. Without a clear connection, Isaac was eventually released in September. In 1909, Abraham Isaac and his wife formed the anarchist-inspired Aurora Colony near Mount Pleasant area of Lincoln, California. The 150-acre farm was divided into 25 parcels, and about 19 families settled there. They lacked farming experience, and severe freezing killed their citrus trees, and infighting led to the colony's demise. After the Aurora Colony broke up, Isaac stayed on the property, and he became a member of the Farm Bureau and other civic organizations. Isaac died of acute pancreatitis on December 10, 1937. 4 years before his death, Isaac had written a friend. First, the railroad took our pears and plums, and $70 to boot. The good Lord took our citrus by frost, and 2 weeks ago, the Bank of Lincoln closed its doors, and I lost our savings. Farming and ranching have always been an important industry and needed seasonal employees. Many people from Sheridan worked across the river in Wheatland and Eugene Sutter counties during harvest season. One crop was hops that is used in beer production. In the summer of 1913, Ralph Durst advertised for temporary workers to harvest his hops. Durst advertised widely, promising ample work at a high rate of pay to every white hop picker who arrived at his farm by August 5th. He needed about 1,500 men. Unexpectedly, over 2,800 men, women, and children showed up. The pay promised was slashed and living conditions for the workers were abysmal. As soon as harvest began, discontent over pay and working conditions erupted. Blackie Ford was the union representative for the industrial workers of the world, which were known as the Wobblies. He took up negotiations for the workers and presented their demands to Durst. The demands were: pickers be paid $1.25 per 100 pounds of cleaned hops, inspection of clean hops so that they got credit for their full weight picked, drinking water be provided in the fields, improved toilet facility and separate bathrooms for men and women, hiring of an assistant to help children and women load the heavy hop sacks into wagons. Durst agreed to some of their demands: improved toilet facility, providing water in the field, allowing one worker to witness the cleaning of hops. Blackie Ford threatened to strike if the other demands were not met. Durst responded by firing him. A vote was held by the workers, and they chose to strike. Durst headed to town to get law enforcement to break up the mob. Durst gathered Yuba County District Attorney Edward Manuel, Marysville Sheriff George Fox, and a number of other deputies. The sheriff and his men approached to arrest Blackie Ford and the other union representatives. The protesters intervened to stop the arrest. A law enforcement official fired his shotgun into the air in an effort to disperse the crowd. This had the opposite effect, and members of the crowd jumped District Attorney Manuel and Deputy Sheriff Lee Anderson and began beating them. Gunfire erupted, and District Attorney Manuel and Deputy Reardon and two other hop pickers lay dead or severely wounded. In the aftermath, the National Guard was called out, and 100 hop pickers were arrested. Many were beaten and starved to coerce testimony. Blackie Ford and Herman Schur, the union representatives, were found guilty of second-degree murder for inciting a riot and sentenced to life in prison. The Wheatland Hop Riot focused public opinion on the plight of farm workers' conditions. Ford and Schur were eventually paroled in 1924. The Durst Ranch now contains many acres of beautiful orchard land and well-kept barns and sheds. It also has a beautiful home. The original hop dryers are slowly deteriorating and will soon be gone. Prior to 1864, children had to travel to Coon Creek School that was located where Manzanita Cemetery is today. Families were reluctant to settle in the area without a school. So, Rogers opened the first school at the ballroom of the shed. He personally paid the teacher $60 a month plus room and board. Rogers and others petitioned Placer County supervisors to form a new school district. May 7th, 1864, Norwich District was formed, named for Rogers' hometown in Connecticut. Norwich School remained at the shed for 13 years. In 1877, citizens voted to move the school to its current location. The new school was a two-story building with 2 classrooms downstairs and a social hall upstairs. In 1880, the name of it was changed to form Sheridan School. In 1881, the school had an enrollment of 33 boys and 30 girls. After the fire in 1890, the population of Sheridan drastically declined. The graduation class of 1900 was 1, Oscar Britt. An interesting state law went into effect in 1872. School grounds must be adorned with fruit trees and shrubbery. Instruction must be given in reading, writing, spelling, arithmetic, geometry, grammar, history, vocal music, and industrial drawing. Sheridan Elementary is still a small school. With kindergarten through 5th grade, the 2019 enrollment was only 56 children. The current principal is Emily Ortiz. We work together at Creekside Oaks. With the population of Placer County growing, Sheridan will grow as families look for affordable housing. Like in 1872, Miss Ortiz said they are adding more trees this summer. Although small, you can see the pride in the school. I attended 5th and 6th grade at Sheridan Elementary, and I fondly recall playing baseball on the fields. The school looks great. Most early residents prior to 1875 were buried in either Manzanita or Wheatland cemeteries. Sheridan Cemetery's first resident, shall we say, was Quincy Morrison Stancliffe. Quincy came to California from Missouri to try his luck at gold mining. Later, while working in Sheridan, Quincy drank water from a contaminated well and became very sick. Eugene Rogers, the founder of Sheridan, took him in and cared for him. He began to recover, but relapsed and died July 27, 1875, at the age of 25. Rogers wrote the family to inform them about Quincy's death. Rogers and Quincy's sister, Addie, continued to correspond and eventually exchange pictures. Addie and her sister Lucy taught school. They moved to Sheridan, and Addie began teaching. Addie and Eugene Rogers were married in 1877. Soon most of the family had moved to Sheridan. As they died, they too were buried near Quincy on the hill. Diphtheria epidemics struck periodically in the 1800s. In October of 1877, an outbreak struck Sheridan. First to die was the 3-year-old son of Jonathan and Marion Briggs. On the 30th, the Click family, the owners of the Sheridan Mill, oldest daughter, Annie Laura, died. Then tragically struck again when their 2-year-old son Ramsey and their 8-year-old son Harvey were taken by the agonizing disease. In 1888, the Sheridan Lodge 312 of the International Order of Oddfellows bought 2 acres from Rogers for its members. In 1921, members of the Russian colony, who I will describe in a later chapter, were denied permission by the Oddfellows to bury one of its members. So they formed their own Russian colony cemetery north of the Oddfellows site. In 1928, the Oddfellows, Sandcliffe, and Rogers plots were deeded to Placer Cemetery District No. 1. After much strife, the Russian section was deeded over to the Cemetery District in 1970 by Jack Suzoff, William Boganoff, and Willie Popoff. In September of 2004, the Lincoln Silver Star Parlor of the Native Sons of the Golden West dedicated a plaque to the history of Sheridan Cemetery. It was a wonderful day with lots of pioneer families and members of the Native Sons attending. Sheridan Cemetery is still a well-kept and beautiful cemetery on the hill. In 1853, Williamson Graham built the Graham Hotel north of a wire bridge that spanned the Bear River. It was located on the stage route to Nevada City. He also built a store that provided hot food, rest, and provisions to the weary travelers. During the early years, the hotel served as a meeting place for locals and a courtroom for the circuit judge. The site was abandoned in 1879. In September 2010, the Wheatland Historic Society and the Historic Club E. Clampus Vitus dedicated a plaque on the north shore of Cantonment Far West commemorating the hotel and store. South Sutter Water District was formed in May of 1954 to develop, store, and distribute water for agriculture from the Bear River and nearby watershed. Cantonment Far West Lake was completed and dedicated on April of 1964. The bridge over the spillway was installed and dedicated in 1969. An interesting fact was the bridge was originally on the Eel River in South Scotia, California. Water from Cantonment Far West Lake supplies agriculture in Placer, Yuba, and Sutter counties, supplementing water drawn from wells. The lake is popular with campers and fishermen and boaters. When I was young, we spent many fun weekends water skiing there. A 7-megawatt hydroelectric power plant was installed at Cantonment Far West in the spring of 1985. The generator supplies power to Sacramento Municipal Utilities District using PG&E lines. A smaller plant was built on the canal approximately 4 miles downstream from the diversion dam in 1985. Power from it is sold to PG&E. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this little history of Sheridan. If you'd like to see more of my videos, just search for Dave Lightfoot on YouTube. Thank you very much.